Indiana, 1944. German POWs were stunned when families let them join Sunday dinners. I was a private from the Afrika Korps. My uniform was still covered in farm dust. They offered me an empty chair at their table. It belonged to their son, fighting in Europe. The Geneva Convention promised us food, not kindness. We were told to expect cruelty from Americans. But the truth was stranger, and held a quiet rule we could not yet understand. When your enemy shows you mercy, is it to save your soul or to break your will? Let us know where you're watching from, and the local time. We are curious how far these accounts reach. If mercy and memory matter to you, subscribe to keep these stories alive. In the late summer of 1944, in a small kitchen in rural Indiana, Margaret Johnson performed a quiet ritual. She pulled an extra chair out from against the wall and set it at the head of the Sunday dinner table. It was a sturdy oak chair, worn smooth from years of use. For a moment she let her hand rest on its high back, her thumb tracing the familiar grain of the wood. This was her son's chair, and he was 2,000 miles away, somewhere in France. He was a sergeant with the 2nd Infantry Division. For 20 months, the chair had sat empty, a silent testament to the hollow space in the home. After a long, steadying breath, she pushed the chair back against the wall. The ritual was complete. But this Sunday was different. That afternoon, another young man would sit at her table. He was not her son. He was the enemy. His name was Hans Weber. He was 19 years old, a former private in the German Afrika Korps, captured in the dust of Tunisia the year before. He now wore the letters PW stenciled in white across the back of his U.S. Army issue work shirt. Along with 5 other prisoners from the nearby service forces camp, he had spent the last 6 weeks helping the Johnsons and their neighbors bring in the harvest. The labor was hard, but it was honest, and it was a world away from the barbed wire. When Margaret's husband, Frank, told the boys their work was done for the day, Hans expected to climb back into the flatbed truck that would ferry them back to camp. Instead, Margaret stood on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked directly at Hans, her expression unreadable. She said his name and motioned toward the house. One of the other prisoners muttered a warning in German, his eyes narrowed with suspicion, but Hans felt a pull he couldn't explain. He walked toward the farmhouse, his boots heavy with dirt and uncertainty. The scent of roast chicken and baked bread met him at the door. Inside, the kitchen was warm and filled with light. Margaret pointed him to a basin of water on the back porch to wash up. As he scrubbed the grime from his hands and face, he caught his reflection in the small, wavering mirror hanging by the door. He saw a boy's face, thin and sunburnt, framed by unfamiliar American work clothes. He looked nothing like the soldier he was trained to be. He looked like a farmhand. When he stepped back inside, the table was set. Margaret's husband and their 2 young daughters were already seated, and there, placed between them, was a single empty spot. She guided him to a chair, not the son's chair, but one just beside it. He sat down stiffly, his back ramrod straight. He did not know the rules for this. His mind raced, replaying the propaganda films he had been shown for years. The films of monstrous, cruel Americans who hated Germany and everything it stood for. The films that promised starvation, torture, and humiliation for any soldier who fell into their hands. He looked at the woman who had invited him into her home. Margaret Johnson was not a monster. She was quiet and steady, her face etched with a gentle weariness he recognized from his own mother. She placed a steaming platter of chicken on the table, followed by bowls of mashed potatoes, green beans, and a basket of warm biscuits. Her movements were calm and deliberate. She served her children, her husband, and then she turned to him, her guest, and put a generous portion onto his plate. Hans stared at the food. It was more than he had seen in one place since before the war. His fork felt impossibly heavy in his hand. He gripped it so tightly his knuckles turned white, a tremor running up his arm. He was paralyzed by a profound and terrifying confusion. Then Frank Johnson bowed his head. The 2 little girls folded their hands. Margaret closed her eyes. They began to pray, their voices a soft murmur in the quiet room, giving thanks for the food and for their safety. The words were in English, but the melody of reverence was universal. It was the same sound he remembered from his own childhood home in Bremen, before the world had gone mad. In that moment, something inside him fractured. The certainty of his hate, the armor of his ideology, began to crack. This scene, and thousands like it, was playing out across America. By 1944, the United States held over 425,000 enemy prisoners of war, the vast majority of them German, in camps spread across 46 states. The government's policy was guided by the Geneva Convention of 1929, which mandated humane treatment. This meant German POWs were to receive the same food rations as American soldiers. But official policy was one thing, reality on the ground was another. With so many American men overseas, the country faced a severe labor shortage, especially on its farms. And so, the War Department began contracting out prisoners. Nearly 90% of German POWs in America worked outside the wire, in fields, canneries, and forests. They became a daily sight in small towns across the Midwest and the South. No longer just figures in a newsreel, they were the young men sweating in the sun, stacking hay, and repairing fences. They were neighbors, of a sort. This proximity, this day-to-day contact, began to erode the very foundations of war. It replaced the myth of the enemy with the reality of a person. As Hans ate the chicken and the warm, buttered biscuit, each bite felt like a betrayal and a sacrament all at once. The Johnson girls watched him, their curiosity unvarnished by prejudice. The younger one giggled when he struggled to ask for more water, his English clumsy and thick. He felt a blush creep up his neck, not of shame, but of a simple human awkwardness he had not felt in years. He thought of his own family, of his mother, and what she might be eating in war-torn Bremen tonight. He wondered if she was safe. He wondered if she was even alive. For the first time since his capture, the American family across from him did not feel like his enemy. They felt like a mirror, reflecting a life he once knew. As the truck rumbled back toward the barbed wire of the camp that evening, the taste of homemade pie still lingered in his mouth. The propaganda had been a lie. They told him Americans would hate him. But this family had shared their Sunday dinner. They had prayed with him at their table. He was a prisoner of war, yet for a few hours he had been treated not with cruelty, but with a quiet, inexplicable dignity. And that single act of mercy was more disorienting than any interrogation he had ever faced. The quiet acts of kindness were not confined to a single Indiana farmhouse. They rippled across the country, following the lines of barbed wire and the dusty farm roads that led away from the camps. In the autumn of 1944, deep in the Texas Panhandle, Reverend Paul Kramer stood before his small Lutheran congregation. Born to German immigrants, he spoke the language of his parents as fluently as he spoke English. He looked out at the familiar faces of his flock, and then at the 4 young men sitting stiffly in the back pew. They were prisoners from nearby Camp Hereford, an sprawling facility that housed thousands of German soldiers. The camp commandant, Captain Robert Harris, a man who lived by the book, had permitted the Reverend to invite a few prisoners to Sunday service, provided they were under guard and caused no trouble. Kramer had agreed. He saw them not as the enemy, but as boys, lost and far from home, who shared his faith. He announced the first hymn, and as the old organ wheezed to life, he began to sing. The words that filled the small wooden church were not English, but German. For the 4 prisoners the sound was a physical shock. They had not heard the hymns of their childhood sung freely in over a year. One of them, a young corporal who had served in Italy, leaned over to the man beside him and whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "It sounds like home." After the service, the congregation held a picnic on the church lawn. The prisoners were offered plates of fried chicken and potato salad by women who could have been their own aunts. They spoke little, their posture rigid with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion, but they listened as the pastor moved among them, speaking to them in their mother tongue about their families and their hometowns. This was an America they had never been told existed. Camp Hereford was an anomaly, often referred to by the prisoners themselves as the Fritz Ritz because of its comparatively humane conditions. But the policies that allowed Reverend Kramer to open his church doors were part of a broader, pragmatic American approach. With the approval of the U.S. Army service forces, local farmers, and community leaders could contract POWs for work, creating countless points of contact between captors and captured. In communities with large German-American populations, like those in Texas and the upper Midwest, the line between enemy and kinsman became blurred. These families looked at the young men in their fields and saw not faceless soldiers of the Third Reich, but boys who looked and sounded like their own cousins or grandfathers. They shared a language, a faith, and a cultural memory that war could not entirely erase. They saw sons, not monsters, and this simple act of recognition changed everything. It transformed official policy into personal connection, one church service, one shared meal at a time. By the harvest of 1945, this pattern was deeply embedded in the rhythm of rural life. In Kansas, a young German POW spent his days helping a farmer bring in hay, the sun beating down on his back. He worked alongside the farmer's own family, his body sore but his mind strangely at peace. In the evenings, he would sometimes sit at the kitchen table with the farmer's 3 young children, who were endlessly fascinated by his accent. He taught them a simple German nursery rhyme, his deep voice soft as he sounded out the unfamiliar words for them. The children would giggle, repeating the phrases with clumsy delight. The farmer's wife, a woman who rarely spoke to him directly, would press an extra piece of warm cornbread into his hand as he left for the truck back to the camp. It was a small gesture, almost invisible, but it spoke volumes. It was an acknowledgement of his humanity, a quiet statement that here, at this table, he was more than just a number on a prisoner roll. This widespread kindness was not simply the result of spontaneous compassion, it was also, in part, a calculated strategy by the U.S. War Department. American military intelligence, through its Special Projects Division, understood the power of humane treatment as a weapon against Nazi ideology. Propaganda had taught these soldiers that capture meant abuse and death. By showing them fairness and decency, America was systematically dismantling the lies they had been fed. The official line was that kindness was not weakness. It was a demonstration of a stronger, more confident set of values. A well-fed, fairly treated prisoner, the thinking went, would be more likely to return to Germany after the war with a softened attitude toward democracy. He would be living proof that everything he had been taught about the enemy was false. The numbers bore this out. Records from the Provost Marshal General's office show that by 1945, nearly all able-bodied German POWs were engaged in labor outside their camps. They were a constant, visible presence in American life. This proximity made the abstract idea of the enemy impossible to maintain. In a hidden corner of a Kansas barn, one prisoner found a discarded feed sack and a nub of a pencil. Late at night, by the dim light of the barracks, he carefully wrote down the words that had been circling in his head, the truth he could not speak aloud. "Today I ate with Americans," he wrote. "They bowed their heads to pray. I wept into the bread." But the table of mercy was not a simple refuge. It was also a battlefield of the mind. Not every prisoner saw kindness as a gift. Some saw it as a weapon, a subtle and dangerous poison designed to weaken their resolve. In the sweltering heat of a Louisiana afternoon in early 1945, a young prisoner returned to his camp barracks after a Sunday dinner with a local Cajun family. He was still tasting the unfamiliar spice of their cooking, still hearing the lilt of their strange French-inflected English. He felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the humidity. But as he entered the long wooden hut, another prisoner, a hard-faced corporal who had been a loyal party member back in Germany, blocked his path. The corporal's eyes were cold. He had seen the truck drop the young man off. He knew where he had been. He spat on the floor near the man's feet. He accused him, his voice a low hiss that carried through the tense silence of the barracks, of betraying his country, of letting the enemy soften him with food and smiles. He said they were poisoning him with kindness, turning him against his own people. The young man stood frozen, the warmth draining out of him, replaced by a cold, creeping shame. Around him, other prisoners watched, their faces impassive. He was now an outsider in both worlds. This internal conflict was the hidden war being fought inside the wire fences. The Nazi government had spent more than a decade perfecting its propaganda machine, building a fortress of fear and hatred in the minds of its soldiers. They were explicitly warned that capture by the Americans meant starvation, torture, and a dishonorable death. The daily reality of their captivity, the 3 meals a day, the fair wages for their labor, the invitations to dinner, was a direct assault on that fortress. For the most fanatical prisoners, this reality could not be accepted. They established their own harsh hierarchies within the camps, punishing those who showed any sign of fraternizing with the Americans. They enforced loyalty through intimidation and accusation. A man who accepted a second piece of pie could be branded a traitor. The U.S. Army was acutely aware of this dynamic. In internal reports, military intelligence officers from the Special Projects Division noted the growing tension. One officer astutely observed that the better the Americans treated the prisoners, the more the prisoners were forced to question their own cause. Every act of decency was a crack in the foundation of their ideology. Every shared meal was a victory for a different kind of power. Then came May of 1945. Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. For the prisoners in America, the news arrived not with a bang, but with a strange, hollow silence. In a camp in Minnesota, a German officer received a letter from a relative who had escaped the firebombing of Dresden. The letter was heavily censored, but the words that got through were enough. His city, his home, was gone. His family was likely gone with it. The news spread through the barracks like a fever, a quiet wave of unimaginable grief. That following Sunday, the officer was part of a work detail sent to a nearby farm. He went through the motions of his chores, his body moving but his mind 1,000 miles away, picturing a landscape of ash and ruin. As the day ended, the farmer's wife, a kind woman who had often shared fresh milk and bread with the prisoners, invited him to join her family for dinner. It was a gesture she had made many times before. But today, it was impossible. He sat at her table, a plate of roast beef and potatoes placed before him. It was a feast, a symbol of American abundance and safety. But all he could see were the flames. He could not lift his fork. He could not swallow. The kindness on his plate and the horror in his mind could not exist in the same space. Mercy and grief sat side by side, and the contradiction was suffocating. This was the final devastating paradox of the German POW experience in America. They were the safest soldiers in the Second World War. Out of the 425,000 German prisoners held in the United States, only about 2,000 died in custody, the vast majority from illness or accidents. For soldiers who had fought on the Eastern Front, where a German prisoner's chance of surviving Soviet captivity was less than 40%, American camps were not prisons, they were sanctuaries. Yet this physical safety came at a psychological price. They were preserved while their world burned down. One veteran wrote decades later, reflecting on his time in America, "We left as free men in spirit, but we returned home to ruins and silence." The mercy they were shown was real, but it was insulated from the consequences of the war they had helped to start. It was a kindness that flourished far from the battlefield. And so, a new, haunting question began to form in the minds of the men who had shared Sunday dinners with their enemy. Was the mercy they received a true reflection of the American heart, or was it an easy virtue, made possible only by the safety of distance? The war ended, but the silence remained. In the spring of 1946, the ships began to arrive. Under a massive repatriation program codenamed Operation Swallow, the United States started sending the hundreds of thousands of German prisoners home. The men who boarded the vessels were not the same soldiers who had been captured on the battlefields of Africa and Europe. They were healthier, better fed, and profoundly changed. They carried with them not just their few meager possessions, but the memory of America's tables. They spoke of it among themselves in hushed tones on the long voyage across the Atlantic, the taste of real coffee, the surprise of a second helping of pie, the quiet dignity of a family prayer. But as they stepped onto the shores of a shattered Germany, a new silence fell upon them. Their homes were rubble, their families were scattered or gone, and their neighbors looked at them with suspicion. They were the men who had survived, the men who had been treated well by the enemy. Their stories of kindness were met with disbelief, or worse, with bitter resentment. And so, most of them learned to stop speaking of it. The memory of mercy became a private one, a small, secret flame kept alive in the cold landscape of post-war Germany. But the memories did not die. Decades later, as an old man, one former prisoner recalled his time in a camp in Wisconsin. He spoke not of the barbed wire or the guard towers, but of the simple things. "They gave me soap," he said, his voice quiet with the weight of the years. "And they let me pray at their table. I carried that home." This was the true, lasting impact of America's policy. It was not just about fulfilling the letter of the Geneva Convention. It was about planting a seed of a different possibility in the minds of the defeated. For some of these returning soldiers, the fair treatment they received became the cornerstone of a new belief system. It was undeniable proof that the Nazi ideology, which was built on a foundation of hate and lies, was wrong. These men became a quiet but powerful force in the rebuilding of a democratic Germany, joining pro-democracy groups and sharing their experiences as evidence that a different way of life was possible. The kindness shown to them at a Sunday dinner table had become a political act, a testament to the power of human decency in the face of absolute destruction. The memories were not only carried back to Germany, they remained in the small towns and on the farms across America. Families kept scrapbooks with faded photographs of the young men in their ill-fitting work clothes, smiling awkwardly over a slice of pie. They were strange souvenirs of a strange time, a reminder that the lines drawn by war are often more blurry up close. For the women like Margaret Johnson, the experience left an indelible mark. They were the ones who had turned national policy into a personal act, who had faced the enemy not with a weapon, but with an invitation. They had answered the call for labor, but in doing so, had found a way to assert their own sense of morality in a world that seemed to have lost it. They had looked at the enemy and chosen to see a son, a brother, a hungry young man far from home, and in doing so, they had held on to a piece of their own humanity. One evening in the late autumn of 1946, the war was long over, and the rhythms of life in rural Indiana had begun to feel normal again. Margaret Johnson was setting her kitchen table for dinner. The air was crisp, and the familiar scent of roasting meat filled the house. She set out the plates, the glasses, the forks, and then she walked to the wall and pulled out the sturdy oak chair, the one that had sat empty for so long. This time she placed it at the head of the table, not as a memorial but as a seat to be filled. Her son was home. He had returned from Europe a month earlier, thinner and quieter, but alive. As he took his seat, Margaret paused. Her eyes drifted to the other chair, the one where the young German prisoner, Hans, had once Saturday. For a moment she saw him there again, a ghost of a memory, his face a mixture of fear and wonder. The two young men, her son and the German boy, had been on opposite sides of the world, fighting a war that had torn the world apart. Yet, for a brief time, they had both found a place at her table. She looked at her son, then at the empty chair, and she whispered the simple truth she had discovered, a truth that had guided her through the darkest days. "No one," she said to herself, "should have to eat alone." The Germans had expected hatred. What they received was stew and prayer and a place at the table. They had been prepared for anything but the stunning, world-altering power of a simple Sunday dinner.